The thermometer outside Elias Thornton's cabin registered a bone-chilling -52 degrees Fahrenheit. This was a temperature that had already claimed the lives of 17 men across the Colorado Rockies during the infamous blizzard of 1883. Inside his snug little log cabin, which was buried under a staggering 12 feet of snow for 6 long weeks, Elias sat comfortably in his shirt sleeves. His mysterious stove radiated a consistent warmth that hadn't wavered for a single moment since the blizzard had begun its furious assault. When rescuers finally managed to dig their way through to his cabin in March, they stumbled upon something that completely defied everything they thought they knew about survival on the frontier: a fire that had burned continuously for an incredible 42 days without needing any tending, and the man who had built it was very much alive and well. Before we get into how this resourceful mountain man accomplished what seemed utterly impossible, please drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. And if you're fascinated by stories of amazing survival against all odds, then hit that subscribe button, because it helps us to bring you more untold stories from the rugged American frontier. The blizzard that slammed into the Colorado Rockies on January 15, 1883, started as a massive white wall that swept across the mountain peaks at a terrifying 60 miles per hour. Weather historians would later classify this storm as the deadliest winter storm to ever strike the central Rocky Mountains during the entire 19th century. By the time it finally ended its relentless fury 6 weeks later, entire settlements had completely vanished beneath the deep snow, and the grim death toll across Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana had sadly exceeded 200 souls. Seasoned mountain men who had managed to survive for decades in the harsh wilderness ended up freezing to death right inside their own cabins. Experienced trappers who knew every single trick for survival tragically died when their fires went out, and they were unable to restart them in the extreme, unforgiving cold. The storm hadn't arrived with any kind of warning. The morning of January 15th had actually dawned clear and relatively mild for the middle of winter, with temperatures hovering around a seemingly tolerable 10 degrees above zero. Trappers were busily checking their trap lines, hunters were diligently tracking elk, and miners were actively working their claims as if it were just another ordinary winter day. But by noon, the temperature had plummeted a shocking 40 degrees. And by sunset, it was a deadly -30 degrees and still falling rapidly. Then came the wind, driving the snow horizontally with such incredible force that it stripped the bark right off of the trees and carved deep channels into the exposed rock faces. Marcus Wheeler, a trapper who was working the Cache-Loudre River drainage, barely made it back to his cabin just as visibility dropped to virtually zero. He spent the next 3 agonizing days constantly feeding his cast-iron stove, burning through his entire winter wood supply in a desperate attempt to keep the interior temperature of his cabin above the freezing point. On the 4th day, with absolutely no wood left and the relentless storm showing absolutely no signs of letting up, he made a daring attempt to reach a neighboring cabin that was located just 500 yards away. Searchers eventually found his frozen body in April, a mere 30 feet from his own cabin door. Similar tragic stories played out all across the mountains. The Hutchinson brothers, who were very experienced mountaineers who had been trapping in the Rockies for a solid 15 years, died when their stovepipe became clogged with ice, which then filled their cabin with deadly smoke. They had to make the agonizing choice between suffocating and freezing to death. They sadly chose the cold. James Morrison, a prospector who was wintering in a reinforced cabin near Breckenridge, managed to survive for 12 days before his fuel finally ran out. His journal, which was found with his body, documented the temperature inside his cabin dropping a horrifying 5 degrees every single hour after his fire had died out. The sheer intensity of the storm completely overwhelmed every single traditional survival method. Standard cast-iron stoves, which were the most advanced heating technology available to the frontier inhabitants, were simply unable to maintain proper combustion in the extreme cold. The metal conducted cold just as efficiently as it conducted heat, requiring constant feeding in order to maintain even the slightest bit of warmth. When men slept, their fires inevitably died out. When they ran low on split wood, they had to venture outside to their wood piles, which proved to be a fatal journey for far too many. The relentless wind found every single gap in the cabin construction, driving snow through spaces that had seemed perfectly chinked during normal weather. It was against this grim backdrop of widespread death and failure that the discovery of Elias Thornton's remarkable survival seemed utterly impossible. On March 3, 1883, a rescue party that was working its way through the valleys to the north of Pikes Peak spotted what appeared to be a chimney pipe sticking out through the snow. The rescue party spent a grueling 4 hours digging down to what they fully assumed would be just another icy tomb. They had already discovered 11 frozen bodies in similar snow-buried cabins throughout the valley. When they finally broke through the cabin roof and dropped down into the interior, they discovered something that simply made absolutely no sense. The temperature inside was a balmy 60 degrees. Elias Thornton was sitting calmly at his table, looking thin but definitely alive, reading a book by the gentle light of a kerosene lamp. His stove glowed with a steady warmth, and a pot of melted snow was steaming gently on its surface. The rescuers stood there in stunned silence, with ice still clinging stubbornly to their beards, struggling to comprehend what they were seeing with their very own eyes. "Gentlemen," Elias said calmly, marking his place in the book, "I was beginning to wonder when someone might finally dig me out." The sheer impossibility of the scene that lay before them completely defied any rational explanation. Every other cabin they had found contained frozen corpses and dead stoves that were filled with cold ash. Yet here was a man who had somehow survived 6 long weeks of being completely buried in the snow, all while maintaining heat in conditions that had tragically killed seasoned mountain veterans. When they finally asked him how his fire had managed to keep burning continuously, Elias simply gestured towards the peculiar stove that dominated one corner of his small cabin. It looked absolutely nothing like any stove that they had ever seen before in their entire lives. In order to fully understand just how Elias Thornton managed to achieve what so many others could not, we need to go back 5 long winters to the year 1878. That December, Elias had been diligently working his trap lines in the high country along with his partner, a German immigrant by the name of Wilhelm Stenberg. They had carefully built their winter camp at an elevation of 9,000 feet, which was higher than most trappers dared to winter, but it was strategically close to prime beaver territory. Their cabin was solid and well-built, their wood supply was more than ample, and their stove was the very best cast iron model that was available from Denver at the time. But on December 29th, a sudden and fierce cold snap dropped the temperatures to a deadly -40 degrees. Their stove, which had performed quite adequately in normal winter conditions, suddenly became a losing battle against the brutal Arctic air. No matter how much wood they desperately fed into it, the cabin's temperature just kept dropping lower and lower. The cast iron radiated cold from its outer surfaces, even as a blazing fire burned furiously within. Ice began to form on the interior walls of the cabin. Their water supply froze completely solid. Wilhelm began to show clear signs of hypothermia by the evening, shivering uncontrollably despite the fact that he was sitting directly next to the stove. Elias spent that entire night constantly feeding the fire, but the wood seemed to disappear into the firebox at an alarming rate without producing anywhere near enough heat. By dawn, their indoor thermometer read a frigid 12 degrees. Wilhelm had tragically stopped shivering, which was a terrible sign that his body was shutting down completely. Elias wrapped him in every single blanket they had and prepared to make a desperate run to a lower elevation camp that was located 7 miles away. But Wilhelm was already too far gone to be saved. He sadly died at sunrise on December 30th, freezing to death inside a cabin that had a burning stove. The horrifying experience shattered something deep within Elias Thornton. He had done absolutely everything right. He had followed every single rule of winter survival, and he had maintained their fire without a single break, yet he had still been forced to watch his partner freeze to death right before his eyes. The fundamental problem wasn't a lack of effort or knowledge. The problem was with the technology itself. After burying Wilhelm on a windswept hillside, Elias spent the remainder of that long winter observing fire with the intense focus of a man completely possessed. He maintained incredibly detailed notes on burn rates, heat output, and fuel consumption. Where other trappers simply saw a basic necessity, Elias saw a fundamentally flawed system that was failing at every level. His cabin became a makeshift laboratory where he diligently documented every single aspect of combustion in extreme cold. The standard cast iron stove consumed an astounding 8 logs per hour in severe cold, yet it barely managed to maintain barely livable temperatures. The mathematics were merciless and unforgiving. A man needed 96 logs during a 12-hour period just to avoid freezing to death. Sleep became an impossibility without risking death. The demanding fire demanded constant attention, which created a vicious cycle of exhaustion that had likely contributed to many cold-weather fatalities. Elias carefully timed how long different types of wood burned. He measured the heat at various distances from the stove, and he meticulously recorded how quickly the temperatures dropped when the fire diminished in any way. Pine burned very hot, but incredibly fast. Aspen lasted longer, but it produced significantly less heat. The dense oak that he had hauled up from lower elevations performed the best overall, but even it disappeared into the firebox at rates that made survival arithmetic brutally difficult. In February of 1879, Elias descended from his mountain camp in order to visit other trappers. He claimed that he was going for supplies, but he was really going to study their various heating methods. At Jack Morrison's cabin near Fairplay, he found the exact same disheartening pattern of failure. Morrison showed him scorch marks on his floor, where he had moved his stove dangerously closer to his sleeping area in a desperate attempt to maximize heat exposure. The close proximity made the fire much more dangerous, without actually solving the core problem. Morrison admitted that he hadn't slept for more than 2 consecutive hours all winter, as he was constantly waking up to feed the ravenous flames. Thomas Ashford's setup, located 12 miles to the north, revealed yet another failed adaptation. Ashford had actually installed 2 separate stoves in his small cabin, reasoning that the redundancy would somehow provide him with additional security. Instead, he had simply doubled his wood consumption without significantly increasing the ambient temperature inside his cabin. Both stoves constantly demanded to be fed, which created twice the work for only a marginal overall improvement. The cabin's interior still hovered dangerously near freezing during cold snaps, despite the fact that he was burning through Ashford's entire wood pile at an alarming rate. But the most telling visit came at Ben Cooper's cabin in March. Cooper had tragically died just 2 weeks earlier, and Elias helped to recover his frozen body. Inside the cabin, they found clear evidence of a desperate final struggle against the unrelenting cold. Cooper had burned his furniture, his trap frames, and even portions of his log walls in a doomed attempt to keep his stove fed with precious fuel. His journal contained increasingly frantic entries about dwindling wood supplies and rapidly falling temperatures. The last entry, written in a shaky hand, simply read, "Fire dying." By carefully studying these numerous failures, Elias was able to identify the core problem. Traditional stoves were simply designed for more moderate climates, where maintaining combustion was a straightforward process. They relied almost entirely on radiant heat from iron surfaces, which became a significant liability in extremely cold weather. The constant feeding requirement meant that survival depended entirely on staying awake and active, which was an utter impossibility over any extended period of time. And most critically, the stoves had absolutely no mechanism for sustained regulated burning. The fire was either blazing furiously and consuming fuel at an alarming rate, or it was dying down and providing an insufficient amount of heat. There was simply no middle ground and no way to achieve steady, long-duration combustion. Elias Thornton finally arrived in Denver on April 20th, 1879, carrying the accumulated pelts from his winter trapping and a shopping list that would undoubtedly raise more than a few eyebrows at every hardware merchant in the entire city. While other mountain men would typically spend their hard-earned money on whiskey, women, and basic resupply, Elias had entirely different priorities in mind. His very first stop was at the Daniels in Pfizer Mercantile, where he boldly presented a meticulously written list in his precise handwriting. The clerk studied it with growing confusion and bewilderment. 20 pounds of copper coiling, specific gauge. 40 feet of double-walled steel pipe. Cast iron plates of exact dimensions. Fire brick, but not the common type, high-temperature ceramic brick imported from Ohio kills. The unusual shopping spree continued at specialized establishments that most trappers would simply never even enter. At the Colorado Mining Supply Company, Elias purchased equipment that was typically used for assay furnaces, including temperature-resistant gaskets, adjustable dampers, and specialized metal joinings. He then spent hours at Josiah McKenna's metalworks commissioning various custom pieces, including a circular chamber with incredibly precise measurements, steel baffles cut to specific angles, and a peculiar spiral component that McKenna had simply never seen requested before. When McKenna finally asked about the strange component's purpose, Elias simply said that it was for improved heat circulation. Word of Elias's unusual purchases quickly spread through Denver's small community of mountain men. At Hoffman Saloon, where trappers routinely gathered to drink away their hard-earned money, his lengthy shopping list became a source of amusement and ridicule. "Thorne's completely lost his mind," Jake Caldwell declared loudly, slapping the bar for emphasis. "He's spending his beaver money on fancy metalwork like he's building a locomotive." Others quickly joined in on the mockery. Pete Williams jokingly suggested that Elias was secretly constructing a still, though no one could quite explain why he would possibly need fire brick for making moonshine. Tom Bradley suggested that he was probably building some sort of mining equipment, hoping to strike it rich in gold instead of fur. But the most expensive purchase of all came from the Denver Cast Iron Works, a custom-forged firebox with double walls and precisely machined connection points. The single piece alone cost more money than most trappers earned in an entire season. The foundry workers had simply never created anything quite like it before. Elias provided incredibly detailed drawings showing a chamber within a chamber with intricate channels running between them in a pattern that seemed completely unnecessarily complex. He insisted on personally watching the casting himself, carefully checking all of the measurements with calipers that he had purchased specifically for this exact purpose. Beyond all of the intricate metalwork, Elias also bought items that seemed to have absolutely no connection to heating or trapping whatsoever: a clock mechanism from a jeweler, springs typically used in railroad equipment, glass viewing ports designed for industrial boilers, and ceramic fiber insulation that had only recently become available from Eastern manufacturers. Each and every purchase was specific, measured, and meticulously planned out in advance. He carefully recorded every single transaction in a leather journal, sketching out how all of the pieces would fit together in margins that were filled with calculations about airflow and heat retention. By the time Elias finally loaded up his pack mules for the long return journey to the mountains, he had spent nearly every single dollar from his entire winter's work. Other trappers watched him secure the unusual cargo, shaking their heads in disbelief at the incredible waste. But Elias had a clear vision that they simply couldn't see: a heating system that would burn continuously, regulate itself automatically, and require minimal human attention. Elias returned to his cabin on May 3, 1879, and immediately began transforming his living space into a makeshift workshop. He cleared out the old cast-iron stove that had tragically failed to save Wilhelm's life, dragging it outside where it would slowly rust as a constant reminder of inadequate technology. In its place, he carefully laid a solid foundation of fire brick that was mortared together with heat-resistant clay, which he had mixed meticulously with sand that he had gathered from the creek bed. The foundation extended a full 3 feet square, which was significantly larger than any normal stove base, creating a solid platform that would support something completely unprecedented in the world of frontier heating. The construction began with the custom-forged, double-walled firebox. Unlike traditional stoves where the fire contacted the iron directly, Elias's ingenious design created a vital air chamber between the inner and outer walls. He then drilled incredibly precise holes in the inner wall, carefully angled upwards to create very specific flow patterns. The space between the walls would trap the heated air, creating a layer of effective insulation that would prevent the outer surface from radiating cold. He then sealed all of the joints with high-temperature gaskets, which ensured that there would be absolutely no air leakage that could potentially disrupt the carefully planned circulation. Above the firebox, Elias installed his most innovative feature: the spiral copper coil that wound its way intricately through a secondary chamber. Cold air would enter in at the bottom, travel through the heated coil, and then emerge superheated at the very top. The basic physics were borrowed from industrial heat exchangers, but the specific application was purely his own unique invention. He carefully soldered each joint meticulously, knowing that any failure in the coil would render the entire system utterly useless. The gleaming copper shone brightly in the lamplight as he worked, each and every turn calculated to maximize heat transfer. The feeding mechanism occupied several weeks of careful construction. Traditional stoves required physically opening the firebox door to add more fuel, which resulted in losing precious heat each and every time. Elias built a gravity-fed hopper directly above the combustion chamber, connected through an adjustable chute. Fuel that was loaded into the hopper would slide down as needed, controlled by a weighted gate that would respond dynamically to the fire's overall consumption rate. The clock mechanism that he had purchased in Denver regulated the gate's movement, ensuring that there was consistent fuel delivery over extended periods of time. Airflow control proved to be equally complex. Standard stoves used simple dampers that were either fully open or completely closed. Elias installed a series of adjustable baffles that were connected by the railroad springs, which created a sophisticated system that would respond automatically to any changes in temperature. As the fire burned hotter, the expanding metals would shift the baffles in order to reduce the overall airflow. As temperatures dropped, the system would open up to increase combustion. The glass viewing ports allowed him to monitor the fire closely without ever having to open any of the doors, which preserved the carefully maintained internal environment. By August, neighbors who had previously mocked his purchases began to visit his cabin in order to see the strange construction that was starting to take shape. The stove stood 5 feet tall, an imposing presence of black iron, copper, and steel that dominated an entire corner of the cabin. The intricate pipes and chambers created a sculptural quality that seemed more artistic than functional. Marcus Wheeler, stopping by on his way to set his autumn trap lines, walked around the stove slowly, carefully examining it from every possible angle. "Looks like something from a factory, not a cabin," he finally observed. Elias simply smiled knowingly and continued to adjust the various mechanical components. The first test firing came on September 15, 1879. Elias loaded the hopper with a unique mixture of coal dust and hardwood chips, which were materials that would have quickly smothered the flames in a traditional stove. The odd mixture that Elias carefully poured into the hopper would have puzzled any traditional woodsman. Instead of split logs, he had created a carefully formulated blend of coal dust purchased in Denver, hardwood chips from his summerwood cutting, and compressed sawdust pellets that he had formed using a hand press. The resulting consistency resembled coarse gravel more than any type of conventional fuel. Each and every component served a very specific purpose. The coal dust provided sustained heat, the wood chips ensured reliable ignition, and the sawdust pellets provided a consistent burn rate. He had spent weeks carefully experimenting with different ratios, diligently documenting his results in his journal with scientific precision. The hopper itself held enough of the unique fuel mixture for a full 48 hours of continuous burning, which was a capacity that seemed utterly fantastical to anyone who was familiar with standard stoves. The chute connecting the hopper to the firebox featured an ingenious double-gate system. The primary gate, which was controlled by the clock mechanism, opened at regular intervals to release measured amounts of fuel. The secondary gate responded dynamically to temperature, using a biometallic strip that curved with any changes in heat. If the fire burned too hot, the strip would bend, reducing the size of the opening. If temperatures dropped, the strip would straighten, allowing more fuel to fall into the firebox. Initial burns quickly revealed the sheer elegance of the self-regulating airflow system. The primary combustion air entered through adjustable ports at the firebox base, which were controlled by the spring-loaded baffles. The secondary air, preheated by passing through channels in the double walls, entered above the fuel bed through carefully positioned jets. This staged combustion approach, borrowed directly from industrial furnace design but carefully adapted for domestic use, created a rolling flame pattern that extracted the maximum amount of heat from a minimal amount of fuel. The smoke leaving his chimney was notably cleaner than typical wood stove exhaust, which indicated a more complete combustion process. September 22nd marked the very first 24-hour test. Elias loaded the hopper at sunset, carefully adjusted all of the controls according to his calculations in his notebook, and settled in to closely monitor the system's performance. Throughout the entire night, he recorded temperatures hourly, checked fuel consumption rates, and observed the mechanical systems in operation. The clock mechanism clicked softly every 30 minutes, releasing incredibly precise amounts of fuel into the firebox. The temperature inside his cabin remained steady at a comfortable 65 degrees, while the outside temperature dropped to a frigid 22 degrees. Most remarkably, he hadn't touched the stove even once after the initial lighting. Dawn brought clear validation of all of his hard work and effort. The fire was still burning steadily. The hopper showed that there was 3/4 of its capacity remaining, and the cabin maintained comfortable temperatures without any additional intervention. But Elias wasn't satisfied with mere success. He spent the following weeks refining the overall system, carefully adjusting the spring tensions, modifying the gate angles, and experimenting with different fuel mixtures for varying weather conditions. He discovered that adding crushed pine resin to the mixture created hotter burns for extreme cold, while increasing the sawdust ratio provided gentler heat for milder days. The true test came in November during an early winter storm. Temperatures plummeted to -15 degrees, which were conditions that would have demanded constant attention with a traditional stove. Elias's ingenious system adjusted itself automatically, increasing the fuel flow and the air supply in order to maintain a constant interior warmth. He slept soundly through the entire night undisturbed, waking up to find the fire burning exactly as he had left it. The impossible had somehow become routine, a fire that tended to itself. The winter of 1882 arrived with unusual ferocity, bringing the very first genuine trial of Elias's revolutionary heating system. On December 2nd, the temperatures dropped to a deadly -35 degrees with winds that drove the effective temperature even lower. Across the entire Colorado Rockies, trappers huddled next to their stoves, burning through their precious wood supplies at alarming rates. But inside Elias Thornton's cabin, something completely unprecedented was taking place. While others were desperately fighting simply to survive, Elias was maintaining his normal routine, checking his trap lines during the daylight hours and returning to a consistently warm and comfortable shelter. Word of his comfort during the harsh cold snap traveled rapidly along the informal communication network that connected the isolated mountain dwellers. Jake Caldwell, who had mocked Elias's purchases back in Denver, arrived at his cabin on December 15th after hearing numerous rumors of the self-feeding stove. He entered the cabin to find Elias working on his trap repairs in his shirt sleeves. The interior temperature was a comfortable 68 degrees. Caldwell stood there speechless, with ice still melting from his beard, trying to reconcile the undeniable warmth with his own brutal experience maintaining fires through the previous weeks. "Show me how it works," Caldwell finally managed to say, his skepticism crumbling rapidly in the face of such undeniable comfort. Elias demonstrated the impressive system with quiet pride. He showed how the hopper's fuel mixture flowed at regulated intervals, how the mechanical gates responded dynamically to changes in temperature, and how the double-walled construction retained heat while the copper coil system distributed it evenly throughout the entire space. Caldwell watched the clock mechanism trigger a fuel release, saw the fire respond with increased intensity, and then observed the automatic dampers adjust to maintain optimal combustion. The entire sequence occurred flawlessly without any human intervention whatsoever, a mechanical ballet of cause and effect. More visitors followed as the word continued to spread. Thomas Ashford abandoned his failed two-stove system in order to study Elias's ingenious design. Ben Cooper's brother, Eugene, traveled an arduous 60 miles through incredibly difficult conditions specifically to see the stove that required absolutely no night tending. Each and every visitor arrived skeptical and left completely converted. They meticulously measured the fuel consumption against the overall heat output and found ratios that seemed utterly impossible. Where their stoves consumed a cord of wood per week in severe cold, Elias's system used less than half that amount in fuel mixture while maintaining consistently higher temperatures. The technical details fascinated those with a mechanical inclination. The staged combustion created a blue-white flame that danced beautifully above the fuel bed, extracting energy that was typically lost up the chimneys of traditional stoves. The insulated firebox retained heat for hours, even if the fuel delivery stopped completely, providing a crucial safety margin that was simply unknown in traditional designs. The carefully designed viewing ports allowed for easy flame monitoring without ever having to open any doors, preserving the carefully maintained combustion environment. Every single element worked together harmoniously, creating a system that was far greater than the sum of its various components. By January of 1883, a dozen trappers had attempted to replicate Elias's revolutionary design, with varying degrees of success. Some managed to create crude approximations using salvaged materials, achieving longer burn times, if not true self-regulation. Others commissioned components from Denver foundries, trying desperately to match Elias's exact specifications, but most of them lacked either the mechanical understanding or the patience required for such precise construction. They achieved some improvement over traditional stoves, but they could not match the revolutionary performance of the original design. The approaching storm would soon demonstrate the life-or-death difference between merely adequate and truly exceptional. January 15, 1883, began with an ominous stillness that experienced mountain men immediately recognized as nature holding its breath. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the barometric pressure had dropped so precipitously that Elias's ears popped inside his cabin. He looked out through his window to see a massive wall of darkness advancing menacingly across the peaks, swallowing mountains in sequence, like some mythological beast. He had perhaps only 30 minutes to prepare. Moving with practiced efficiency, he topped off his hopper with fuel mixture, filled every water container from the nearby creek, and secured extra supplies within easy reach. The storm struck with a violence that completely defied any description. Winds exceeding 80 miles per hour drove the snow horizontally, creating instant whiteout conditions. The temperature plummeted an incredible 50 degrees in just 2 hours. Elias's cabin shuddered violently under the intense assault, the logs creaking ominously as pressure differentials tried to tear the entire structure apart. Snow began accumulating at rates that seemed utterly impossible, rising a foot per hour against the windward wall of the cabin. Within 6 hours, drifts had completely covered all of his windows. Within 12 hours, only the chimney pipe remained visible above the ever-growing snowdrifts. Inside, Elias's stove continued its steady mechanical rhythm, completely oblivious to the raging catastrophe outside. The clock mechanism clicked softly. Fuel fell, flames danced merrily, and dampers adjusted themselves. The temperature inside held steady at a comfortable 65 degrees, while mere inches away on the other side of the log walls, conditions that would freeze a man solid in mere minutes raged unchecked. The stark contrast was simply surreal. Elias sat calmly at his table, recording observations in his journal by lamplight, while the deadliest storm in Rocky Mountain history had buried his world. Days bled into weeks without any visual point of reference beyond the glass-covered portholes of his stove. The hopper needed refilling every couple of days, a simple 5-minute chore. His fuel supply, which he had calculated for a typical winter, turned out to be more than enough for continuous burning. The mechanical systems worked perfectly. The springs, gates, and dampers maintained their synchronized operation without a hitch. While other mountain men were fighting a losing battle against the freezing cold, exhausting themselves trying to maintain inadequate fires, Elias read books, kept his equipment in good working order, and slept soundly through the night without interruption. The psychological challenge was a bigger hurdle than the physical one. Being completely buried created a sensory deprivation that would have driven many people to the brink of madness. Elias stayed sane by sticking to a strict routine, checking the stove's operation every hour, recording temperatures and fuel consumption, exercising within the cramped space, and preparing meals at regular times. His journal entries from this period show a man who is very aware of the historical significance of his survival. Day 23. One entry reads, "Stove continues to operate perfectly. I estimate there are 8 feet of snow above the roof, based on changes in the chimney draft. The temperature inside remains comfortable. Fuel reserves are approximately 60%. February turned into March, and still there was no break in the burial. Elias had no way of knowing that the storm had actually ended after 8 days, and that the weeks of confinement that followed were due to accumulated snow, not continuing precipitation. He simply kept up his routine, trusting in the mechanical perfection of his heating system. The stove that others had derided as being overly engineered and complex had become his lifeline, burning continuously for 42 days without a single failure, keeping him warm while winter claimed lives all across the Rocky Mountains. The rescue party that broke through Elias's roof on March 3, 1883, included Marcus Wheeler, who had once dismissed the odd-looking stove as being unnecessarily complicated. Wheeler later described the moment to a Denver newspaper. "We were expecting to find another frozen body. Instead, we found Thornton alive and well, reading by lamplight, as warm as summer inside, while we were half frozen from digging. That stove of his was still burning as if he'd just lit it that morning, except he'd been buried for 6 weeks. I've never seen anything like it, before or since." News of Elias's survival spread faster than an avalanche. The Denver Post ran a front-page story on March 12th with the headline, "The Fire That Would Not Die. Mountain Man Survived 6-Week Burial." Reporters struggled to explain the mechanical principles to their readers, settling for phrases like self-feeding marvel and mechanical wonder. But in the mountains, where survival was more important than journalism, trappers understood exactly what Elias had achieved. He had solved the fundamental problem that killed men every winter. Elias responded to all the attention with his characteristic practicality. Instead of cashing in on his fame or seeking patent protection, he opened his cabin to anyone who wanted to study his design. Throughout the spring and summer of 1883, a steady stream of visitors arrived. He provided detailed drawings, explained his construction techniques, and shared his fuel mixture recipes. When asked why he wasn't going to profit from his invention, Elias replied simply, "Wilhelm died because our stove wasn't good enough. If this design saves others, that's payment enough." By autumn, modified versions of the Thornton stove had started to appear throughout the Colorado Rockies. Blacksmiths in Denver, Fairplay, and Leadville began producing components based on Elias's specifications. The Denver Metalworks Company offered a complete kit for $75, including pre-cut double walls, mechanical gates, and clock mechanisms. While it was expensive compared to traditional stoves, the investment turned out to be worthwhile. The winter of 1883 to 1884, although severe by normal standards, saw a dramatic decrease in casualties among trappers and miners who had installed the new systems. Documentation from that time period shows the design's impact. The Colorado Territorial Census of 1885 included a question about heating methods, showing that over 300 households were using self-feeding or mechanical stoves. Mining companies that operated at high elevations began installing industrial versions of the stove in their bunkhouses. The Consolidated Silver Company reported a 40% reduction in winter wood consumption after converting to the Thornton design heating system. More importantly, they reported 0 cold-related casualties among their workers, compared to losing 2 or 3 men every year in previous years. The design continued to evolve as different craftsmen added their own improvements. Some replaced the clock mechanisms with water-powered regulators that used freezing and thawing to control the fuel flow. Others experimented with different fuel mixtures that were optimized for local materials. But the core principles, double-walled construction, staged combustion, automated feeding, and temperature-responsive controls remained the same. By 1890, what mountain men called Thornton stoves had become standard equipment for anyone who was serious about winter survival above 8,000 feet in elevation. In 1997, a team of engineering students from the Colorado School of Mines discovered an intact Thornton stove in an abandoned cabin near Mosquito Pass. The structure had partially collapsed, exposing the interior walls to decades of harsh weather. Yet the stove was still functional. When they dismantled it for study, they found mechanical principles that predated similar industrial applications by 30 years. The double-wall construction anticipated modern heat exchanger designs. The staged combustion system matched patterns that were used in efficient furnaces developed during World War II. The automated feeding mechanism employed feedback control concepts that wouldn't be formally described until the early 20th century. Professor Margaret Chin, who led the analysis, published findings that challenged assumptions about frontier innovation. Elias Thornton, working alone with basic tools, had created a heating system that matched or even exceeded modern efficiency standards. His empirical approach to thermodynamics, which he developed through observation and experimentation, led to solutions that trained engineers would later discover in laboratory settings. This wasn't just primitive technology that had been refined over time. This was genuine innovation, born out of necessity. Elias himself lived quietly through the transformation that his invention had sparked. He left the mountains in 1889, using the savings from his trapping years to purchase a small ranch in Wyoming's lowlands. He married Sarah Morrison, the sister of the trapper who had died in the Great Blizzard of 1891. They raised 4 children, who knew their father as a mild-mannered rancher, not as the man who had revolutionized frontier heating. His journal, which was donated to the Denver Public Library after his death in 1912, reveals a man who was more interested in solving problems than in claiming credit for his work. The last entry, written 3 days before his death at the age of 71, reflects on his legacy. Sarah asked if I regretted not patenting the stove design, seeing how widespread it had become. But every winter, I think of men sleeping warm through the night instead of having to tend to fires. I think of Wilhelm, who might have lived if our technology had been better. That's worth more than any patent royalty. The fire keeps burning, passed from one builder to the next. That's enough. Modern estimates suggest that Thornton stoves saved between 200 and 300 lives during the frontier period, from 1883 to 1900. The principles that he developed influenced heating technology throughout the American West, from the gold rush cabins of Alaska to the high-altitude mining camps of Arizona. Historians of technology cite his work as a prime example of frontier innovation, practical, easy to share, and born from immediate need rather than abstract theory. Today, historical preservationists maintain 3 original Thornton stoves in working condition. Each winter, they are fired up for demonstrations. The mechanical gates still click in rhythm, and the flames still dance in the patterns that Elias calculated with just a pencil and paper. Visitors watch the automated systems in action, marvel at the elegant engineering, and invariably ask the same question: how did one man, working alone, create something so advanced? The answer lies not in genius, but in necessity, not in education, but in observation, and not in complexity, but in understanding fundamental principles. The impossible became possible because one mountain man refused to accept that staying warm meant staying awake, that survival required suffering, and that the way things were was the way they had to be.